For a time during the 1970s, Led Zeppelin was the biggest rock and roll band in the world. However, a pair of tragic deaths that occurred towards the end of the decade put an end to their momentum. Join FactsVerse as we take a look at Led Zeppelin deaths that utterly destroyed the band. Led Zeppelin released their self-titled debut LP in 1969 and quickly became one of the most notable rock and roll bands of the 70s. The band consisted of lead singer Robert Plant, guitarist Jimmy Page, drummer John Bonham, and bassist John Paul Jones. Though Robert, Jimmy, and John Paul Jones have played with the late John Bonham's son during a couple of reunion shows, the band essentially lived and died with its classic lineup. Unlike other classic rock bands, Led Zeppelin never switched out members. The members of Led Zeppelin certainly had a strong sense of camaraderie, but they also had their differences. These grew stronger in the years leading up to the band's dissolution. But it wasn't creative differences that ended up doing in the band for good. Instead, it was the tragic death of John Bonham. Even so, John Bonham's death wasn't the first that had come between the members of Led Zeppelin. Years prior, the death of Robert Plant's 5-year-old son almost caused him to quit the band. John Bonham eventually talked him back. In 1975, Robert Plant and his wife Maureen got into a car accident. Maureen was nearly killed, and Robert Plant had to be confined to a wheelchair for some time. This was the year the band released Physical Graffiti, which many consider to be their last great album. As a result of his wheelchair confinement, Robert lost a lot of spirit and didn't bring all that much soul to the 1967 album Presence. This album was received much less positively than Physical Graffiti, and many believe Led Zeppelin were on their way out. This ended up being the truth, though the band's end didn't come via burnout. 2 years after Robert survived his car accident, a much greater tragedy happened. During Led Zeppelin's 1977 tour of the US, he received terrible news from home. Robert's 5-year-old son had passed away as a result of a stomach infection, and Robert was devastated. There hadn't been a whole lot of positive vibes on the 1977 tour beforehand, and the news of the death of Robert's son only made things worse. During their 1977 tour, all the members of Led Zeppelin were knee-deep in substance abuse habits. The worst culprits were Jimmy Page and John Bonham. Jimmy was a heroin addict, and his abuse caused him to be decidedly secretive and withdrawn. Meanwhile, John Bonham's abuse of alcohol made him obnoxious and belligerent. Although John was drunk for the entirety of the US tour, he ended up being the only member of Led Zeppelin to attempt to console Robert Plant after the singer received his tragic news. Bonham also ended up being the only member, besides Robert himself, who attended the young boy's funeral. Robert was especially perturbed his longtime friend Jimmy Page didn't show up. Robert chalked Jimmy's absence from the funeral up to the guitarist's antisocial nature and worsening substance abuse habit. Still, Robert held a grudge. From the 1975 car accident that left him temporarily wheelchair-bound to the 1977 death of his son, there were numerous things going on in Plant's personal life during the mid-70s that took his focus off the band. And considering none of the members of the band were getting along well at the time, it's not surprising Robert decided to call it quits after returning home from the tour. At that time, he also quit all of his substance abuse. Sadly, neither Jimmy Page nor John Bonham followed suit. John Bonham's substance abuse habits would significantly worsen over the ensuing years, which inevitably resulted in his own tragic death. Before we tell you more, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to FactsVerse if you haven't already. Although Robert Plant eventually returned to Led Zeppelin, the singer never felt the same way about his work with the band after the death of his son. Robert had come to view much of his previous time with Led Zeppelin in a negative light. It seems Robert began to believe that the debaucherous rock and roll lifestyles that he and other members of the band had been leading karmically resulted in his son's death. He returned to Zeppelin towards the end of the 70s at the behest of John Bonham. When Robert came back, the band was reborn, though its second life didn't last long. John's substance abuse habit was worsening, and it only continued to worsen leading up to his 1980 death. In 1980, Led Zeppelin was preparing for another US tour. They were rehearsing in England when tragedy struck yet again for the seemingly cursed band. Despite having successfully talked Robert Plant to come back to the band, John Bonham seems to have become a bit disenchanted with Led Zeppelin himself by 1980. It was likely just the alcohol talking, but it seems John had grown quite jealous of his fellow bandmates, who he felt were all more talented than him. Bonham's jealousy and substance abuse were making rehearsals nearly impossible to accomplish, and Led Zeppelin wondered if they'd be able to perform on their upcoming tour dates after all. A few months before his death, the drummer had passed out during a show that Zeppelin played in Nuremberg. The other band members convinced the tabloids the medical episode was unrelated to his alcohol consumption, but they knew deep down John's problem was only getting worse. Legend has it that John was passed out drunk and simply never woke up, though an assistant for Led Zeppelin remained adamant they had left John sleeping on his side, and that the drummer choked on his own vomit and passed away. The remaining members of Led Zeppelin became suspicious when John didn't show up for rehearsal the next day. John Paul Jones went to check on him, only to find John Bonham deceased. John Paul Jones had to break the news to his bandmates. Bonham was only 32 when he died, and he likely would have had a few more decades of rocking out if it hadn't been for his nasty substance abuse habit. The remaining members of Led Zeppelin weren't keen on finding a full-time replacement for John, so the band came to an end. Their last album was 1979's In Through the Outdoor, though sadly they didn't get the chance to tour the US in support of it. Though Led Zeppelin is officially broken up, all of the other former band members, with the exception of John Bonham, are still alive. Every once in a while, the three remaining members get together with John Bonham's son to perform reunion shows. But all three surviving members of Led Zeppelin have moved on to other interests. Fans have come to view the band's surviving members as having a lot of integrity for never trying to replace John Bonham. Though their last two studio albums were not near the critical hits that their most acclaimed previous works had been, the band still ended its run on a high note and is considered to be one of the most consistently revered bands of all time. Now it's time to hear from you. What's your favorite Led Zeppelin album? Let us know in the comments section below. And before you go, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to Facts First if you haven't already. Click the bell icon to stay updated on all our latest content. By the way, if you haven't joined Facts First as a member yet, be sure to look below this video and click the join button. By becoming a paid member of Facts First, you'll get access to exclusive video content that you won't find anywhere else. This includes some of our more mature content that isn't suitable for public audiences, which includes topics like Hollywood actresses who posed for Playboy and some of the steamiest moments in movie history. Plus, you can enjoy these videos completely ad-free. Our biggest fans will notice they also get badges next to their name when they leave comments on our videos. We pay special attention to comments from our members, and so do other viewers. So if you want exclusive content from Facts First or inside access to discussions with other community members, click the join button to get started for just $4.99. There are hours of members-only videos waiting for you, with new videos added every month. And we're actively working on bringing even more features to help fans like you connect with other members and get more of your favorite content. Just click join, and we'll see you inside the membership tab.